Welcome everyone to today's webinar. We will get started. My name is Denise Webster. I'm the VP of Food Safety over at SCS. I'm in charge of the training and consulting side of the business. I've been in the food space for 28 years, working in food manufacturing, brands, retail, been in a lot of factories, and I am very excited today to co-host this webinar with Melissa Calicia. She and I have known each other for many years and have worked in many factories and working to try to elevate standards, and I really think you'll enjoy this webinar today. Melissa, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Hi, Denise. Thank you so much for you and SCS for inviting me to speak today. I'm Melissa Calicia, and I'm the Chief Science Officer and developer of EBAC-MAP. And as Denise said, we've spent decades working on environmental pathogen monitoring and developing modernization tools to help us be more effective as an industry. Thank you for inviting me.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Melissa. And I'm looking forward to hearing your portion of this webinar myself as well today. So we'll get started. For those of you that don't know SCS or joining us for the first time, we are a certification body. We offer all types of certification around the globe, sustainability, and all of our major markets, as well as the food and ag service. We handle our audits, from labeling compliance to agriculture and all of those leading standards that you see here on the screen. So today's topics, we're going to dive into 4 key areas: the requirements and regulatory importance of environmental monitoring programs, making sure we have a firm foundation of what it looks like and why we need to have an EMP. Then we'll learn how to develop a robust EMP plan that is tailored to your facility. It's not a standard out-of-the-box, one-size-fits-all solution. It's got to vary depending on your facility and your product risk that you manufacture. We could probably spend a whole webinar just on that topic, but we will touch on those highlights that hopefully give you a little more insight in how you can do that tailoring better for your own operation. We'll then pivot to learning about some of the advanced systems to map, track, and trend your results, and best practices on how to address those non-conforming results and reduce your exposure to potential risk. And we'll kind of come out of that and look at the future as well, what's coming down the regulation, as well as things like AI. So we thought we would start off today with a poll. So we'll go ahead and open that first poll up. Okay, the poll is open. What we'd like to hear from you guys is just a pulse check. How robust do you feel your current environmental monitoring program is? Is it excellent? It's detailed, risk-based sampling, it's proactive, or is it maybe good? It is risk-based to some degree, and there's some proactiveness, but room for improvement. Fair. Maybe you just have a very basic plan, it's mostly reactive, or if it happens to be an area where it's an item that needs to be really reassessed for the new year, then that's an honest answer, and we appreciate that. Okay, we'll give you guys a few more seconds for everyone to get their answers in to the poll, and then I'll share the results. Okay, so excellent. We've got 58% of you that have a risk-based program with some proactive approach. That takes a lot of effort to get in that good area, so that's great work. And 19% of you are excellent, and hopefully are here today to learn how you can really move to that even next level of maturity with using more predictive analytics. Melissa, if you want to go ahead and put yourself on mute. And then 21% is fair, and which, again, as I mentioned, and 2% poor is an honest answer. There's always room for improvement, but maybe your operation is new or you're just starting that understanding where you're at in environmental monitoring. So hopefully you'll be able to gain a lot from this webinar. So thank you guys for your feedback, and we can kind of see that we're all at different levels of maturity for EMP program, all working towards achieving food safety. So before we look at the regulatory, let's just look at our GFSI requirements. So many of you on this call are in facilities that are audited by one of these standards, and all require a risk-based environmental monitoring program, right? They don't specify you must have salmonella testing in your environment, or listeria, or this amount of swabs, right? They're looking for your site to have that risk-based analysis of your facility, your history, your product risk, the design and hygiene, to determine how robust and how in-depth it needs to be, and what do you test for. And we tend to talk about just pathogens when we're establishing our EMP program, but that also means your air plates, your water sampling, your indicator organisms on food contact surfaces. So it's all of those things. Today, we kind of skew towards more that pathogen discussion due to the importance, but that's not to take away from all of the environmental program testing and sampling that should be occurring to make it robust. Additionally, GFSI expects that we do an annual minimum reassessment. We're at that time of the year right now where we're planning for next year. This is a great time to look at your results and revitalize that plan, document your reassessment, what's working, what's not working. If you have no findings in your environment, BRC requires you to take a reassessment to ensure that you're swabbing the right locations, that you're digging deep enough. So really that reassessment is a great time to do that here before the end of the year. Also, they do require you to have that laundry list of sample locations, to have a effective and meaningful rotation, and that the methods that we use are valid. They're AOAC, FDA compliant type methods. And ultimately, we have to have that proof, that data, that we can show those test results, that we have monitored, tracked it, trended it, reviewed it. So this is, a very robust program in all of our GFSI requirements. Okay. Further, if we look at it from the regulatory lens, both FDA and USDA have regulations involving environmental pathogen monitoring in ready-to-eat foods. Their focus is on ready-to-eat foods, ultimately because that is where most of the risk is, but that does not mean that things like, non-ready-to-eat foods doesn't have an environmental pathogen program. USDA has a classification for minimal environmental for even on the raw side, or if you have raw and ready to eat going on in your operation, then there's going to be that importance of that plan. So this is just the bare minimum if we think about it from a regulatory perspective. We also have to look at the potential implications of a regulatory environmental pathogen finding. Once they come into your facility and do those swabathons, or for cause or for purpose of investigation, those results are forever. They go into that database, and if they do find a pathogen in your environment, it goes all the way down to that DNA level. And if once it's in the database and there's an outbreak associated with that pathogen and that strain, that then they can track it back to your facility. So it's an interesting concept, and I'm sure Melissa will have more in her section to talk about this as well. But so we have to look at it from both the health and the business perspective, and really know ourselves what's going on in the operation, and not allow the regulatory bodies to be the ones to find it and to tell us that we have a problem, right? We have to, this is the purpose of the plan. And technology has changed with significant increase in characterization, specificity, increasing exactly what I was just talking about, and the ability to link environment with the food and the food with the foodborne illness cases. Ultimately, the failure to control environmental pathogens and post-lethality ready-to-eat food, as we've seen in many of the unfortunate outbreaks that are happening right now, do have a significant public health impact, from illnesses to unfortunate deaths. EMP is key for this. It's that effective feedback loop and strategy that can help us mitigate failure. So we wanted to spend a few minutes just talking about how do we handle persistence of pathogens in the environment from a regulatory perspective. FDA has emphasized on not just individual swab findings, but on trends. So they understand that we need to look at these findings from a trend standpoint, a percent incident rate. That tracking and trending helps to identify those persistent conditions and patterns in your operation, whether it be in a particular zone, in a particular area, whether it's transient through your operation, or it's finding a nice cozy place in your operation. And it then requires us to have that deeper dive root cause analysis so we can determine corrective and preventive action and really understand what those trends mean. And so this is where I'm going to pass it off to the expert to talk more about this slide. Melissa?
Thank you, Denise. You know, when we look at this graph over here, the table, you know, in a program, in an environmental monitoring program where we haven't necessarily modernized it to the point to optimally, we're often using spreadsheets. I'm sure that most of you are nodding your heads that you're using spreadsheets to try and monitor the rate of contamination or the incidence of contamination, and then try and make some sense of where those occurrences are. And in this example here, looking at results, overall results, let's say this is a low moisture facility and this is a salmonella, or this is a high moisture facility for listeria. If we know that, if we're tracking by month and we know that we have 1 in 7 positive listeria genus in January, and we track it number of positives over total number of samples, it looks pretty simple. And if we look at the number, if we look at the ones in red, those are where positives came up, and we look down at the bottom and say, hey, in January and March and April and June, July, that was a zone 3 site positive at the drain by the cooler. And in May and July, in zone 3, we had cartwheels come up. And in June, we only had one sample that didn't recur, one site that didn't recur, and it happened to be the underside of a conveyor. Well, if I think that obviously, as Denise referred to, our target, what we're trying to assess and control, is invisible to we humans. We can't see the bacterium, the target organism. And so we're left with, okay, what are the traces of it that we can find, and how often does it happen? So if you take this, I'm sure not many of you on this webinar only take 10 swabs per month, or 8 to 10 swabs per month. And when you start multiplying it by the numbers of samples that we do collect, and then trying to track that in multiple areas throughout the facility, multiple work zones and whatever, it's so complex, it's overwhelming to we humans, even though everybody on this webinar is superhuman, and I know you are. However, it can be overwhelming as humans. And so modernizing the program so that we can understand really where the persistence is happening and what sites it's associated with, and being able to see that is the whole game. And it's what, as Denise said, is really going to take us to the next level in our programs. And so we can look at the incidence rate in overall, and in next to the listeria column, we can say, well, you know, we've got some incidence rates, and the question might be, well, what zone are those in? Or what site are those in? And some of these, it's the same site recurring. So while our incidence might be moderate here, the incidence at an individual sample site over a quarterly period might be sky high because it's repeating at too high of a rate. And so how we look at the data and slice and dice it, especially given FDA's emphasis on persistence, when they come in and do a swabathon, they're looking at, they report to a firm, they're looking back at the last time they were there, and they're looking at what sites are the same and where they've recurred, and they're focusing on recurrence heavily. And then they're looking, if they've performed any subtyping, they're looking at, from their own samples, what the subtypes are that they've recovered from your facility. And if they've recurred 4 years later, 10 years later, 15 years later. And so recurrence is a big issue. And so if we have good controls on our EPM, we're going to be in a good spot.
Excellent. Thank you, Melissa, for that insight. And yes, I agree. This data seems daunting. How much is too much? What do we do with the data? Ultimately, FDA has published, a guidance on specific Listeria monitoring. They have a detailed analysis of that data for trends, as we talked about, which is looking at if there is an increased incident in the same or similar area, what do we need to do about that? If our overall percent incidence of an environmental pathogen is increasing, as well as that individual swab site, how do we ensure that we are understanding that impact, and how close is it truly in terms of getting to that zone 1 finished product food contact exposure area, and that analysis of overall trends in detection of course, finished product. Are we ever testing finished product and putting on hold? Do we have confidence in that data? Other considerations they've noted in this guidance document, and if you have not read this guidance document, I would definitely encourage you to Google it today, download it, and make sure you're reading it. It is FDA's current thinking on the topic, right? It's not regulation, but it's their current guidance and thinking, and so we have to act as such, and to use that for considerations such as looking at people flow, product flow. So as Melissa talked about, if it's that cart that's going from point A to point B, is that crossing over raw to ready to eat, or more sensitive, higher care, high risk areas? There's been past outbreaks associated with trash carts going out through to the low risk area and then back into high risk area without a effective cleaning and sanitation of those wheels or the area, and effectively then you're bringing it in through that flow and transient of people, product, or processes. Temperature differentials. When I'm building out a Listeria swabbing program, I'm always looking for those areas where there's hot and cold. Edges around a cooler, ventilations, transition zones, those are, I want to swab there because I want to see if Listeria is harboring in those locations, because they like that wet, kind of cold, warm situation. And then just also overall design and hygiene of equipment. I've had history, and I know Melissa has a whole history of brand new equipment within a few months having issues. It's designed for the food industry, but there's a bunch of engineers designing these equipments, not a bunch of microbiologists, right? So there's seals and things that we can't get to. And I've had issues where it's the brand new equipment that's gotten us in trouble, and not the older equipment. So don't always think it's to the old equipment. We have to really look at the design and hygiene and just our overall robustness of our sanitation program. Any further thoughts on this, Melissa?
No, I think you hit the high points.
Okay, excellent.
I think we'll touch on trends a lot more and further here. So. Okay,
perfect. So if you want to go ahead and start with this one.
Sure, great. So yeah, obviously you want to make your EMP tailored or aimed at your facility, your product. It's the conditions of use of the food, conditions of storage of the food, how sensitive it is, and as Denise talked about, ready to eat or not, and RTE, and what those implications are. So risk assessing to define your target organisms and what frequency they're going to be, your sampling plan is going to involve relative to all those sites within your facility and all those work centers and throughout different zones. It has to be very specific, and we'll talk a little bit about that in future slides here. You want to design a sampling plan with appropriate representation. You know, I've in so many cases I've worked on regulatory issues where regulators have come in, done a swabathon, and they've found multiple positives, and the firm hadn't been finding any positives. And when the firm asked the regulator, well, what's wrong? What's going on? Well, we don't find it. And the regulator invariably says, you're not sampling enough. And so it may not be necessarily they're not sampling enough, but are they representing the right surfaces? And so here's a analogy. Think of each area, each piece of major equipment, each trash can, movable pallet jack, forklift, whatever, as a haystack in your environment. And there's a needle. There's potentially a needle in that haystack. And we talk a lot about randomizing our sampling so that nobody knows we're coming or where we're going to swab that day. And we have equal probability of finding an issue or not. And sometimes we want our sampling to be biased in a way that helps us best to seek and find and destroy. And so if we're gonna take that approach, we're gonna have more earlier century information that we can react to. And that's understanding that if a needle's in a haystack and the density of the needle is different than the hay, and the needle will fall by gravity to the bottom of the haystack. Well, if we're looking for needles, we may want to be looking at the bottom of the haystack, where it contacts the ground or the floor or whatever. And so that's what I mean by biasing it. It's not always at the ground level, but it's where that contaminant or what target we're seeking may evidence itself. And so using a kind of a stratified approach where we're using a surveillance approach to determine if the target exists. So we're sampling fairly wide. But in the case of the needle in the haystack, we're sampling wide areas underneath that haystack where it joins the floor, and we're sampling wide areas. We want to know if it's there. And then what we do is go back, if we find a needle in our biased sampling, surveillance sampling, then we can go back and look and do vector sampling and determine where it may have originated from. Find out if there are more needles throughout that haystack, and the one we're finding that by gravity shifted downward and was detectable is evident of clusters or areas within that haystack. And so that's the same concept as a piece of equipment that we're talking about. And so surveillance, a wider surveillance approach, is a little bit harder because you may find more needles. You may have to react to more needles. However, when you do that, you're going to be able to remedy investigate them, root cause analysis, and remedy the condition that's leading to those needles being there. And so that's where, and if we look at each haystack, each piece of major equipment in our environment, for example, in each work center and area and whatever, if we do that and we were to try and take sampling from within the haystack, the probability that we're going to find our needles diminishes because of dilution alone. And so when Food and Drug comes in and they're sampling your haystacks, and they sample a lot, they collect a lot more samples than you normally do. And if you're not doing a haystack approach where you're stratifying your sampling, and the probability the agency is going to find it is way higher because they're collecting more samples, and they're representing more surface. And so that's all that happens. And so in modernizing your environmental, your EMP, also the strategy, besides all the tools and the digitization and things that we're going to talk about, the fundamental approach is worthwhile to reassess, as Denise talked about. So we want to, the vectors, the surveillance approach is to determine if contaminants are there, and of course the vectors are to figure out where they originate, and so we can correct that condition and eradicate. So the EMP, increasing our understanding of what occurs where, if it's contaminated, and then where, increases the probability, the possibility for collaboration between all of your response teams that you work with every day in your facilities. You know, your sanitation, your maintenance, your operations, your production, your science team, everybody coming together so that they can understand what those findings are and see what you see, can help garner ideas. And when they can hear, when everybody can hear one person talking about the same thing and be on the same page, why then gives other people other ideas, and the collaboration starts to happen pretty readily. So an EMP obviously depends on a really well-designed program that's got a really healthy feedback loop. And so if we look at the outer boxes here, those are, of course, our monitoring inputs as part of our EMP program. And what those are going to include may be, depending on your facility and your product and your process and everything else, it may include, your monitoring may include pre-op ATP surface swabbing for your real-time indicator, where you re-clean and retest and then you report. And obviously you've got a visual sensory inspection for whether soils appear to be adequately ridded from food contact surfaces and environment. And it can also include pre-op or operational indicator microbial evaluation, where your corrective action is to re-clean and retest and report. And then comes your EPM, where you're looking for your pathogen or pathogen indicators, primarily Salmonella, Listeria, depending on your product. And all those inputs, what we're in a non-modernized program where we've got to do everything manually, what we're doing is responding to each one of these non-conformances on monitoring individually. So, and some of the best firms in the world that I've worked with on investigating and correcting issues, most firms I come across and I work with have extraordinary reaction to individual non-conformances. They want to correct it, they want to eradicate it, they want to do intensified cleaning, resample, and make sure that they've knocked it back. But when we do that on an individual basis, and we're not looking at holistically at all the data, the sum of the data, we may be missing patterns, as Denise said, patterns, trends, associations as far as work area, work center, traffic pattern, whatever. We may be missing the whole picture, and we may not really be getting to root cause if we're only addressing individual findings one at a time. And that's where the power of modernizing the program and considering the aggregate works. So when we're looking at corrective action, or excuse me, looking at the data and aggregating it, we're going to look at the aggregate, individual and aggregate, for repetitive failures, repetitive nonconformances, where they happen, how often they happen, when they happen, and look at the trends, look at patterns, spatial patterns. We'll talk more about that. Look at those, and then start looking at our root cause analysis, and in this case, a wider root cause analysis that we can utilize data from multiple possibly related inputs or sources. And then that's what drives our cleaning and sanitization and other changes, so that we can correct identify the root cause and correct it, and ultimately have better control. And so just for definition purposes here, I'm sure this is probably what everybody uses, but the identifying our locations and frequency, and for that representation we talked about, is quite important to identify what you define as zone 1 versus a zone 2 versus zone 3 versus a zone 4. And these are obviously our sanitation zones. Most people consider food contact as zone 1, and also surfaces where contaminants, if present, could drip, drain, or be drawn onto food or food contact surfaces. So zone 1 is a little wider for most firms. Zone 2 is usually adjacent, non-food contact, but adjacent, nearby. And zone 3 is usually non-food contact that's removed from zone 2, a little further from zone 2. And zone 4 is usually non-processing areas that may ultimately impact as a source, processing areas. The reason I bring this up is that we do want to, in our Modernize program, we do want to understand and monitor what our incidence is in zone 1 relative to zone 1 only, relative to zone 2 only, relative to zone 3, and relative to zone 4. And we can actually combine those if we wanted to an overall incidence. But if we had a 5% incidence rate of listeria in our process overall, our overall incidence in the facility was 5%, you might look at that and go, well, that seems pretty good. That's a number that's not published, but often Food and Drug considers that to be acceptable steady state, provided you don't have patterns, trends, recurrences, and you don't have that persistence issue. They think that's okay, but it's not published. However, if any of those findings, environmental pathogen or pathogen indicators, is in zone 1 and we had a 5% incidence, we got a big problem, right? So we want to set, in a modernized program, we want to set specific incidence rates that trigger us for corrective action by zone, and then also together, cumulatively. Is our product and facility and equipment risk reflected in the program? We want to make sure it does, and that we've got proportional sampling to these sanitary zones as that's appropriate. Are the site locations indicated or codified by zone? If we get a sample result that has a narrative description on it, like underside and frame of the packaging filler, the filler unit, does everybody know which filler that is? Do they know what the underside and frame includes? Do we know that that's a zone? We consider that a zone 2, for example, in our facility. And so, and what that code is, so that we can know if it's recurred. So we want our zones to be evident in our program. We want to do multiple points in an area so that we can understand if we have a cluster of equipment in a work center and we've got positives or non-conformances in zone 3, but none in zone 2 and none in zone 1, that the likelihood, as long as we're representing our surfaces adequately, that the likelihood for zone 1 contamination is diminished. But if we have, if we look at across those zones and we have zone 2 hits or even zone 1 hits, we've got some, that's an entirely different picture. So we want to make sure that we have zones that are adjacent represented periodically at the intervals that we schedule our samples at. Individual sites versus composites, we're going to talk a little bit about that, but that's the compositing approach is more like the haystack approach, where we're sampling wider areas in zones 2 and 3 and 4, for example, so that our probability of detecting defect increases. And of course, if we detect defect and control it better, theoretically zone 1 should be in better control. swabbing strategies. People have utterly different swabbing strategies, and they can have multiple strategies in the same facility. A rotational approach is often used. A surveillance approach, like the haystack approach I'm talking about, where we do compositing, is more generally more effective. But the sanitation crew has to be all caught up. Everybody has to be on the same page, and we have to be in sanitation steady state before we initiate a program with some heavy surveillance sampling. And then, of course, what our vector sites are going to be, and that we go from broad to more specific as far as surveillance is broad, and vector sampling is much more specific, because surveillance is if it's contaminated, and vector is where is it contaminated.
Yeah, and I think, Melissa, there's a point here too that I think we neglect is operational swabbing and doing the swabbings during different times, different types of products being run. You're going to have different things going on in the operation, and that we tend to do environmental swabbing at the same time we're there, maybe pre-op or in the morning, and not doing enough operational as well.
Yeah, that's one of the that's a great point, Denise, and that's, as you know, that's often why when regulators collect samples, they're collecting samples that are often much further progressed into the processing scheme. And so spread factors, movement of contaminants that may exist there, is heavier. And so their probability of finding that defect is higher than ours if we are sampling pre-op or too early into the cycle.
Yeah, and another challenge too is some sites, you know, it's a bit of a fear factor to test a zone 2 or a zone 1. I understand. I've been there. We have a poll to kind of get your guys' views on this. Does your EMP include operational zone 1 swabbing? So give you guys a few more seconds, and then we'll share the results and kind of talk about it before we move on to some modernization approaches. All right, looks like a good majority of you guys have answered the poll, so we'll go ahead and close that poll. And this time I'll remember to also close it next time. All right, so we'll share the results. 63% of you do operational zone 1 swabbing. Great job. You're past that fear factor. You know, tasted the insect, and you know, understand the importance of it. And then 27% of you, we, you know for whatever reason, maybe it's a lower risk product and you don't feel that, you know, it's necessarily going to be indicative, or there is just a little bit of that fear factor. How do we switch management mindset to understand it? I always, you know, when I advise clients on this, it's like, you know, start small and have a plan in place. Make sure you put product on hold. Don't do it and then hope for the best. Do it with the thought that you're going to find something, and have that management team completely on board, and everyone is, you know, ready to go. And then once you have that cadence about that program, then you can feel more confident in that ongoing swabbing activity. Okay, so go ahead and hide that poll. Thank you guys for your feedback there. So Melissa, if you could, we have about 15 minutes, and I want to leave room for a few questions. So, but if you could go ahead and take us through your e-back map process.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so when we in eBack Map, which is an environmental pathogen web-based software as a service, and it in eBack Map you can take images from anything. You can take photographs of a piece of equipment, you can take layouts of the facility, and we'll see some examples of those. But this is an example that I put this here specifically to talk about rotational sampling. And, you know, in guidance regulatory guidance, they talk about 1 square foot as a surface area in all their guidance. And if we were to collect 1 square foot areas of zone 2, let's say we define zone 2 as not including food contact surfaces, or zone 1, let's call it. And we decided to do a rotational approach where we take 1 to 2 swabs a week of zone 2 on this piece of equipment. And when we do that, that means that every sampling of each site of each of those zone 2s is going to happen at least once every 6.5 to 13 weeks. And so that may be okay, but when an agency comes in and swabs and collects 4 swabs or 6 swabs of these surfaces, and we've only collected 1 or 2 over 6.5 to 13 weeks, and they collect 4 on the same day, they're representing a lot larger surface area on the same day. So their probability of detecting defect is higher. And the point to this is that if you advance, Denise, the point to this is that with a rotational approach, your chances of finding that detecting that one site are not so high. But if you were to use a surveillance approach where your representation was higher and may have represented if we identified all inside the yellow as zone 2, for example, in our program, then we might take composite of that area. And when the sanitation is in steady state and it's in control, we swab a wide surface area like that represents zone 2, and we get a negative result, we have very high confidence that if FDA or USDA walked in today and sampled that they're not gonna find anything, and that's in control. More importantly, that equipment is in control. And so the guidance calling for 1 square foot is sometimes a little bit causes people to minimize their surface areas, but I would, as far as developing and improving the inputs for your modernized EPM, consider this approach. So if you move to, there we go. So what's the importance of using technology? Again, overwhelm for the smartest individuals on the planet who are on this call. We can be overwhelmed with large amounts of data. And so the technology, as far as software goes, can help us to track and trend, can automatically give us notifications when there are trends or incidence rates that are too high above our limits. Visualization is so important. If we just get COAs and they have a narrative description of a surface area, and that we have a non-conforming result, and we have people who are sanitors, maintenance, and whatever, or people from throughout our organization, the response team, are reading that. So they're taking in text information and trying to imagine where that surface is in your facility that we got a non-conformance on, they got to respond to. That language barriers, shift barriers, lack of intake and visualization data can be overwhelming and can cause us to re-clean, intensify clean, and re-swab actually the wrong area. And so the human brain can process images. So an image of that surface, or the image of that piece of equipment, or an image as part of a map, at 60,000 times faster than it would text that described that surface. 60,000 times faster. We can intake information. Each one of us on the team then has a huge advantage. And 90% of the information that gets transmitted into the brain is visual. And so it's a significant factor as far as advantage and modernizing the program. So we want to be able to see our data using different visuals in correlation with the facility, the equipment, traffic patterns, work centers, product flow, people flow, materials flow, to be able to see what those relationships are. We want to leverage our human capabilities to their fullest. We want to be able to foster discussion where everybody can give input, because the sanitors, maintenance, everybody, when they're all involved and they understand where the findings have occurred, the solutions and ideas that come out of them are priceless. And I'm sure a lot of you are nodding your heads the same way. So we want to foster discussion for more effective and faster response. We can share our information with subject matter experts, our sanitation control company, consultants, and that fosters the ability to do that. Your technology is going to guide your reassessments and provide evidence of reviews, so you can more quickly and easily see what's happening. So the capabilities of a good program are going to be to generate automatically live trend graphs, because that's one way to visually see something where it's not text. The trend graphs are usually overall percent incidence in the facility, so we can see how we're doing overall and track it over time. Overall percent incidence by zone, as I described before, and how important that is. And then overall incidence even by individual sample sites. So tracking and trending individual sample sites to see repetitive issues on those that may have been caused by, influenced by inadequate frequency for deep cleaning, or methodology of cleaning, or whatever it may be. Other capabilities that automations and modernization are the maps themselves. Do you have a map of your overall facility? A lot of people have an overall facility map with the zones 1 through 4 all throughout it. And if your facility is large, that could be a little bit overwhelming. So what a lot of people do in that case is they have an overall facility map that shows you zones 2 and 3. So you can see movement and incidents and where those occurrences are in zones 2 and 3 across the facility. And then you might also have additional maps that are just of your processing room or portion of the line for zones 1 through 3, or a cluster of processing rooms that might be connected to one another, like an equipment washroom, and then a couple of adjacent rooms next to it that are heavily affected by that flow. A specific line that so that it by itself can be evaluated, and specific equipment even, so you can see what the history of results are on that equipment overall. And then you can also see the vector sites on it, mapped on it. And you can see relative to that where the heat is, where the issues are. So you decide what you want, and a good program has all different, can have any kind of map. It can have a diagram that you get from your maintenance department, that you get from your equipment manufacturer who sold you this product line, whatever. It can be a black and white photo. It can be a diagram like this. It can be a flat layout. It can be anything. But the important thing is that you have your sites located, and that the sites be marked with what the zone numbers are and what the permanent sample sites are. It also, if they're vector sites, the V's here are vector sites to a wider surveillance site, and that you can tell what those are by looking at them, because this map doesn't have the data displayed on it, but when you can see the data displayed over it with the sample sites and what they pertain to, it becomes very meaningful. So you can see progressive data over time. You can add to your maps things like, some people add footprints on their map. All this is a drag and drop thing. You can put in footsteps for traffic flow patterns. You can put in movable equipment. You can put in cleaning utensils. They put in everything in their maps, and they have multiple maps, and this is just one of them. They've got a drain down here. When we look at the pattern there where we had positives in the drain and the traffic flows, and and we don't see any incidents, and we don't see any hits up above it. That signals that the contamination may be dragged in from elsewhere. Or I look at that map and I see that there's not samples being collected from the post bagged enclosed samples. So there might be equipment in the room that actually doesn't process exposed equipment, but might be causing and leading to hits in the environment. So looking at, this is just kind of a cutaway, big map, wide map on the left here. And then in the center of that, or right next to it, there we go. In the center right next to it is
sorry, it was moving on its own, Melissa. So sorry.
Oh, sorry. I think it's
automated. I don't know. Sorry about that.
Sorry about that. Well, the bottom line is that we want to be able to see further out views. We want to see more tighter views of portions of things. And we sometimes even want maps of just that piece of equipment and the vector sites associated with it. So we can identify surfaces, its relationship to surfaces that are related to it where we've had hits. So that's the idea of it, locating all those sites. We don't have the display of the data, but I can do a webinar if anybody wants a webinar and show you that. Anyways, so here's a cutaway view of vector sites on a coding reel, and that coding reel, zone 2 came out positive, zone 3 nearby it came out positive, and then when you hit it with the vectors, the control panel here for the on-off switch is where the contamination was. So you can have different maps that have different contents. So digitizing your EPM obviously gives you the ability to recognize conditions that only aggregating all the data can tell you. It's not just that individual one, but you can see the whole picture. And the regulatory agency purview includes food safety parameters, so obviously we can't afford not to. We talked a little about the need for good confidence in effectiveness of sanitation, and we talked about that surveillance approach where we do higher representation, particularly in zones 2 and 3 and 4. And digitizing can help us be able to do that and not be overwhelmed, and to visualize exactly what surfaces were represented. An ineffective feedback system can be costly if it's unrecognized and problems exist, because then we can be caught in a surprise zone 1 finding that implicated product and is going to cause a disaster. Or worse yet, we can be caught in a surprise where the finished product, ready to eat finished product, was contaminated. We didn't know it, it's out in trade, and then we've got illnesses or a recall on our hands. So your digitization allows we humans to focus on responding to trends and patterns rather than just those individual findings. That's the number one, and also the visualization. So when we see when we get a notification that we had a test result that was presumptive, this is from EBACMap, it has a picture, an image of where that sample site is, in addition to an explanation, the name of the location, where it is, what the finding was, what the date was, and so having those kind of information, so we're not relying on text alone, is critical, I think, because there's so many languages and shifts. So we talked about a lot of this already. Heat mapping can tell us when and where our non-conformances happen. They can tell us where our conforming results are, which is equally important, where we're swabbing, where we're not swabbing, and where we might have some voids in our system for that reassessment Denise was talking about. adjacency of locations with non-conforming results and potential impact as source, information further discriminating locations at which target agent was isolated. So if we have had positives and we've got some either speciation or serotypes or ribotypes or whole genome sequence results, we can tag them onto those results and see actually where those subtypes were found and which ones were found where, and on a spatial map that tie in exactly where one was found versus the other. Progressive spread or movement of contaminants in the same or other zones located upstream, downstream, and above is possible with maps. And in fact, an EBAC map, we have on-demand movies that give you the spread pattern, so you can watch the progression of contamination and over pure time to see where it may have originated, where it went to, and what the prevalence is, and if we got it nailed. So a strong
Melissa,
map.
just for the sake of time, we'll just kind of let them read this on their own. But
Okay.
I think, ultimately, we've got some questions I do want to get to before we go through. But your big takeaway I'm hearing is digitize, modernize. There's too much data for us, to do something with in a realistic manner, and that tracking and trending. And maybe we need to take more data. That's what I'm hearing too, and using modernization tools are appropriate.
Yes.
So what is the future of environmental monitoring? Let's not forget a lot of what Melissa said today is about being proactive, so you can react faster and not have those issues that she just spoke to. Also improving our analytics as we move to this age of AI and predictive modeling. We can use the power of AI to, create and collect a lot of this data. So that is, just around the corner to start using that. And that's also not data ourselves, but data out there in the world. I found it very interesting that you mentioned this 5%, percent incident rates. Where is that shared transparency of these food safety? How do we know what is the adequate percent incidence? And ultimately making sure that we can not just automate, but we are creating idea generation, and we can use AI and these tools to help us not just visualize, but also to create more robust corrective and preventive action.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Melissa, just a few questions, I think. I know we're running over, but for those of you that can stay on, we will try to answer some of these. So simple question, but very intriguing. Does this only apply to ready-to-eat processing, Melissa?
Well, no. Food and Drug and their preventive controls rule, if you look at their risk assessment for food types in Appendix 1, preventive controls, if you look at the potential hazards associated with not ready-to-eat foods, they're the same. And so with Food and Drug, if the definition of ready-to-eat is if it can't be reasonably, if it's reasonably foreseeable that somebody's going to consume it without fully cooking it, it's ready to eat. And so when that definition was widened, that means that the need for control widens too.
Okay. And so what's your perspective on this question in terms of, is operational zone 1 swabbing critical? Like, is it not just critical, is it useful? And how do we convince, I mean, I know the answer, it's yes, but how do we convince the team here and our bosses in management that oversee the site that it is useful and critical?
Yeah. So USDA mandates in their rule, zone 1 operational food contact, but FDA does not. It's non-binding recommendation. Okay, how does it? Let's talk about how it doesn't work for you. And I've worked on many of these over the years in my career, where if a firm has a policy and doesn't swab zone 1 operational, then and Food and Drug comes in and evaluates your own data, and they see any occurrences, any findings in zone 3 in a production room or zone 2, and you're not collecting operational zone 1, they have you a little bit against the wall, because what they say is, prove to me that contamination didn't reach food contact surfaces. And when it gets pretty heavy, and it gets to the point sometimes where if the prevalence in zones 2 and 3 or 4 is too high, they may deem that that the product may be adulterated on the basis of impact held process under conditions wherein it may become adulterated. And so if you don't have zone 1 testing results to counter, it can be tough. FDA doesn't really accept finished product results instead of zone 1. Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I mean, that's the bottom line is, some people have an approach where, hey, we test finished product and we test zones 2, 3, and 4 and don't do zone 1. And that doesn't work, because FDA doesn't consider the finished product directly representative of zone 1.
And we have justification on that, right, for that risk-based ready-to-eat product. But there's a question, how do you also justify doing that, though, for lower risk products, right? So maybe not ready-to-eat lines, or, lower risk, perhaps from a dry standpoint. Maybe we're dealing with salmonella. Is it still important? Is there validity in still doing zone 1 in those conditions?
I think there is, but I would say that it would be done at less of a frequency, and that indicators might be performed more heavily in that circumstance, quantitative indicators even, that are grouped, Enterobacter ACA and a low moisture salmonella, or HQA assay, for example, for Listeria in a not ready to eat. And so that various indicators, depending on the food and what you got going on, can help if the food is not ready to eat. And usually when the agency, when it's not ready to eat, especially USDA, you're not mandated to test food contact surfaces anyway. And
right.
So operational food contact, yeah. So definitely I would recommend, if you got an NRTE, make sure that your pre-op, that you are testing pre-op food contact, so that you don't have your starting conditions aren't problematic. And that's a good tact. And pre-op, and then obviously a documented inspection and cleaning and resampling.
Yeah, and we do have a question here that is the kind of scary topic in the room, which is, if you are doing operational zone 1 swabbing, what do we need to do about it? If there's that risk to that food, right? If we do end up finding it, obviously, I think my advice is, we don't usually start there, right? We make sure we have operational zone 3, zone 2 swabbing first, and we know that the facility is robust. Zone 1 swabbing, maybe, from also a finished product standpoint, testing finished product, but it is a needle in a haystack, and you do have to control the product. You can't just hope for the best and release the food. You have to wait for the results, and yeah, there could be an impact on product. I don't know if there's any further advice you have on that risk element of zone 1 swabbing.
I think each and every product, to your point, that you've got to really risk assess and understand, if you're going to sample zone 1 and you get a Listeria genus hit and it's a not ready to eat food, you may not need to speciate to monocytogenes. But if it was a ready to eat food and you got a Listeria genus hit, most people would confirm to LM on an operational food contact post lethality, because otherwise, if called into question, you can't demonstrate Listeria monocytogenes was absent. And so it's a very weak position to be in. So get to my point, or my suggestion, get to steady state, to your point, Denise, in zones 2 and 3 and 4, get your pre-op zone 1s in line and in control and in steady state. And then get for not ready to eat, get onto those zone 1s, move to those when the rest is in control. for a ready to eat, the risk of not having zone 1 operational, as I mentioned before, can be pretty high. If you get called to the mat, it's a very weak position to be in.
Yeah, and power of doing your own swabathons. And we have a question around, if you do find a presumptive positive for Listeria in your normal rotational swabs, do I need to do vector swabbing before or after the clean?
Well, I would always do it after the clean, but operationally. So do your intensified cleaning and then do it operationally, so the spread factor will have been represented, and those surfaces that could have influenced the operational finding prior would be evident. That's what I would suggest.
Excellent.
And if those aren't conforming, then you may need to roll in some pre-op, so to make sure that your foundational starting is effective.
Perfect. And we have quite a few questions, but unfortunately we're out of time today. I hope you guys got a lot of value out of this webinar. Any questions we didn't answer, Melissa and I will put a response together and share that with the entirety of the audience. We'll also be sending out, yes, this deck and this recording, as well as within that, you will have some at the very back end who you can contact for SCS, as well as to get a hold of Melissa if you want to learn more about the eBackMap tools. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and would love to have you back, and please take our survey. And Melissa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.